I would probably start by saying there are lots of different ways to define poetry, but most basically could say that poetry is a special use of language that allows us to present or evoke an experience in a unique way. Obviously, in poetry, the sound of words and the sound of language is interconnected with the sense in a way that is probably not typical of ordinary language, but it is typical in other works of art, that the kind of form in which they exhibit is interrelated with the content, so they're inseparable. I would only just add to that I think defining poetry should always take into account that it has a kind of phenomenal dimension, that it evokes an experience. Well, I suppose the first thing to say about the notion of truth is that it's gone through a pretty radical deconstruction in the last few decades. Scholars of the humanities and perhaps people in the world at large have become somewhat skeptical about ideas of truth and traditional authorities about truth. In philosophy, truth may be defined rather narrowly, and often is defined rather narrowly. And it may also be that where the humanities have in large measure given up on ideas about truth, the sciences have not. So perhaps culturally as well as academically, we may be content to associate truth with scientific endeavor because it's endeavor that allows for verifiability and all sorts of other epistemic validation. Now, I respect that, and yet I wonder if we are giving up too much in removing poetry along with literature and other arts in general from any claims to truth at all. I think poetry allows us to reveal the world in a certain way, to promote critical thinking and critical reflection on our experiences and even on our perceptions. I think poetry engenders questioning, and perhaps even most importantly, it allows us to imagine possibilities for thinking, but also possibilities for living and being, which have an important personal, cultural, and even intellectual and cognitive function. So insofar as poetry contributes in these ways to our cognitive life and our social and cultural life, I think it should be associated with truth. Another aspect, of course, of the question is the way in which truth is an intellectual virtue and an intellectual achievement. I think poetry, not always and not necessarily, but poetry can take part in that in various ways. Well, one of the things poetry does is that it defamiliarizes language, the language we use, and it defamiliarizes the world which it tends to describe. And by doing that, often poetry can reveal the assumptions we might have about reality, whether those assumptions are right or not. It can reveal our ordinary ways of thinking about the world. And poetry can also draw our attention to aspects of reality and aspects of the world we may have overlooked, or perhaps to connections that we may have with other things in the world, for instance, objects of nature, which we may not pay attention to in our everyday life, or even in our pragmatic thinking. So poetry can reveal reality in some of these ways, but perhaps most often what poetry reveals is the reality of human experience and the kind of contingencies of human perception and feeling. It reveals a lot about us, I think, as human beings and the way we engage in the world. Well, I would say that poetry, as I have read and enjoyed as a reader, and as I have thought about as a philosopher, and as well the poetry as I have written about, seems to offer a kind of event of meaning, an invitation to think in new ways, a means of exploring new possibilities about what can be thought and felt, and what can be felt about what we think. And so in some ways I would say it's inevitable that my own poetry is informed by these ideas, but I hope that when I sit down to write a poem, I don't start with the ideas themselves, but rather with an exploration of thoughts and possibilities that it might evoke. I don't want to write poetry that merely embodies ideas, but I suppose it's not a bad thing if it gives some echo of the thoughts that I might have as a philosopher.